Michael Anthony is a truly inspiring and inspirational person. He was born to a hyper abusive and drug addicted mother who cut off his finger at the age of 4. And to a stepfather he prayed he never should have had. And not to mention a grandmother who sent him into an identity crisis. By the age of 9, his family was often homeless and living in poverty, despite being members of the Mormon Church. By the time he was 12, he was adopted by his grandmother and turned to drugs and alcohol to cope with the continuing abuse. However, he persevered through it all, and now he's the best-selling author of the book Think Unbroken, and he's a coach and mentor to other survivors of abuse. He helps them get out of the vortex and discover their own story of hope and help them reclaim their lives. He joined me this week to share his extraordinary story and to impart some encouraging words of wisdom. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. So, Michael, I'll take a few seconds to welcome you to the program, and I'm excited to dive right into what makes you the person you are today, to learn more about your personal and professional life. So great to see you, and thanks so much for being here today, buddy.
Yeah, Kevin, man, my pleasure. I'm super excited to be here, hang out with you a little bit this evening and have a good conversation.
Yeah, so Michael, I'm going to start you off by asking you to sort of categorize your childhood and how that impacted the person and you are today.
Yeah. I'll give you the short version because if I didn't, we'd be here all night.
Oh, I'll
My
go pop some popcorn and come
Yeah,
back.
right. You might need to. My life is very much like a movie, man. I grew up in Indianapolis in the heart of America. My mother was a drug addict and alcoholic. My stepfather was super abusive, the kind of guy you hope is never in your family. We were often homeless. We were often in poverty. I was often like failing in school and being abused, and childhood was just really chaotic. And then around the time I was 12 years old, my grandmother adopted me. Now I'm biracial, black and white, and my grandmother was an old racist white lady from a little town in Tennessee you've never heard of. So now imagine that juxtaposition of growing up and being biracial with a racist white grandmother as a caregiver. So needless to say, my life got a little chaotic. And by the time I was in my late teens, I'd been getting high every day, drinking every day, didn't graduate high school on time. Um, and by the time that I landed in my early 20s, I had somehow found success in corporate America. Not somehow, I'd worked really hard to kind of figure out how to make money, because my thought was, if money is the solution to poverty, then I need to go and make money so I can feel good about myself and life and all those things. Needless to say, as many people know and understand, like once you start to make money, it often exacerbates all of the bad things that happen in your life. And that was my experience in my journey. And I kind of just hit the rock bottom, right? I think a lot of us have this moment, unfortunately, where we kind of hit rock bottom. We have to pull ourselves back up. And that was my experience. And that moment for me was about 10 years ago.
And talk to me about how you built your own personal character and sort of persevered through that moment.
Yeah, Kevin, man, that's a great question. And I think about this all the time because growing up, I was always told I was never going to be anything. I would never amount to anything. It was going to be a really hard life for me. I was never going to be loved or be cared for or any of those things. And think about that. If that gets embedded in your mind as a child, and if it's true that we are the stories that we tell ourselves, then that became my reality, right? And so what I had to face was my reflection when I'm about 25 years old, 26 years old. I'm standing in front of the mirror one day, and I noticed that, man, I'm 150 pounds overweight. I'm smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. I'm drinking myself to death, basically. My life was a disaster. And in that moment, I had to make a decision. What was I willing to do to have the life that I want to have? Because for so long, I had envisioned this idea that I could have success and happiness and love and peace and prosperity and all of these things, but I had not yet put myself in a mindset that allowed me the space to step into that. And so, to answer your question, the biggest part of this, how I built myself, was I first had to have the willingness to accept the possibility that I could actually have this life, that I could be happy, that I could be loved, that I could be a part of something great. And then I had to do the work. Right. And that's where it got really difficult because I had to get serious about therapy. I had to go and do all these different things in terms of group therapy and EMDR and going to Alcoholics Anonymous and trying to just understand not only addiction, but understand abuse, and then going to trauma summits and seminars and literally being the only person in a room full of doctors without a doctorate degree trying to learn and understand about the human brain and body. And ultimately rebuilding myself, right? Going to self-help conferences, reading the books, listening to the podcasts. And podcasts weren't really a thing when I started this journey, but finding every bit of information I could and consuming it. And then the hard part, executing against it and moving into those things in a way that actually made me grow, trying hard things, getting uncomfortable, becoming vulnerable, and working through the shame.
And Michael, I'm curious to also ask you about the importance of being vulnerable and open to express your emotions and feelings. Certainly, we've all been through quite the year with 2020 with COVID, and certainly a lot of people have gone into darker places because of the lack of social interaction. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on the year we've been through and the importance of being vulnerable as well.
Man, Kevin, that's literally one of the best questions anyone's ever asked me. I think that I know that 2020 was incredibly hard for so many of us. I just posted today, it's this dark place. And even in all the darkness that life can be, there's always some light. There's always a way to find a way to make life what you want it to be. And so much of that is the defined narrative that we have to create. And again, the same concept I just spoke of allowing ourselves to step into it, because it's so easy to get down on yourself. It's so easy to be upset. It's so easy, especially right now, to not be willing to try hard. And I get it because we're trapped, and depending on where you are in the world, you might be in total lockdown. There's no gyms, there's no restaurants, people are hurting. But the thing that I understand and know about humanity better than anything is that if we are still alive, there is always a possibility that we can move into what's next. And vulnerability is a big part of that. And here's why. Because when you get vulnerable, not only with yourself first, but with other people in a healthy way, then you open up the opportunity to step into this thing where we build community and companionship. And that gives us the ability to leverage this idea of help, right? Think about the idea that it's okay to ask for help, that it's okay to be vulnerable enough to do that. And one of the really sad things about living in Western society and really the world as a whole is often it's frowned upon to ask for help, to seek this idea that someone can assist you in helping you go into this path. Because I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone who's ever done anything great on their own. And I think asking for help is such a cornerstone of vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a follow up to that in terms of we're living in sort of a fractured society now, Michael, as you know. And I'm also curious to get your thoughts on the importance of healing division and finding some center of unity.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that that's the cornerstone of this, right? Because as a community, and yes, we are very fractured right now, especially if you're in North America, and more so, especially if you're in America, and or the United States, I should say, excuse me. And with that, you here's what's fascinating, right? Because there's a juxtaposition here. On one hand, you do have this fractured social construct, but it also on the other side is a reciprocation of this idea that now we've kind of separated what it is to be accepted and not accepted in culture, and that being racism and sexism and all the isms, and disallowing them to be okay. And the fracture, I think, more so than anything, is finally us as a people drawing a line in the sand and saying we're not going to allow this anymore. But the beautiful part about that fracture is it's created community, right? We walk down the streets holding hands with people of different races, colors, genders, sexes, of the whole gamut of human beings, saying we want equality, we want peace, we want justice. And there's something really beautiful about that. And I think as we continue to head down the road to what's next as a society, because like look at Black Lives Matter movement, it's so incredibly important, right? And it was global. I mean, there were people all over the world who participated in that. So yes, on one hand, we're fractured, but then look at the community that starts to build around things that are healthy and important.
And the idea of equality and inclusion, as you know, Michael, I was born with what's called spastic quadriplegia cerebral palsy. It just simply means that I don't have enough oxygen in my legs to walk normally, and it affects things like my muscle movement, memory, and that sort of a thing. But my question in this regard is in connection to the whole idea of collaboration to get things done when you're talking about diversity and inclusion. So I'm also curious to get your thoughts on the importance of societal inclusion for people with disabilities.
Yeah, it's a must, right? It's a must. And I think I was labeled with disabilities as a child, learning disabilities, and I had problems walking when I was first born. I had to wear a small leg brace for a while. And I think about how obviously incredibly lucky I am that I was able to have the corrective practices go into place to be able to fully be able to move my body. And here's one of the things I don't think people think about enough, Kevin, is this idea of you should be super grateful that you're alive, right? There's a 1 in 78 trillion chance that we could even be here and even have this conversation. And I have an immense amount of gratitude just that I get to be inside this body. And yes, it's difficult, and yes, it's hard, and I have my own issues that I'm constantly dealing with. But the fact that we get to be here and even having this conversation is so beautiful in consideration that it's implausible. And so that said, I think that we do absolutely, without question, have to be inclusive. And I often think about this, we're so quick to judge in society and look at and label people without understanding who they are. And when I was young, people would look at me and they'd go, oh, he's the poor kid. He's the learning disabled kid. He's the kid who's never going to amount to anything. And think to myself, when we put those labels on people, that's impactful, right? It not only hurts them, but it actually hurts us as the people who are doing it, because we've now closed our thought process and our hearts to this idea of possibility. And I think if we're going to grow as a society, possibility means that everyone gets to have their place at the table, right? Because ultimately it's community that's going to guide us to what's next, and everybody needs to be a part of that, because this earth, this life that we're living, it's not owned by any one singular person, right? We are here as a collective, and that unity, in order for us to grow and to heal and to change society, like it's got to be done through inclusion.
Absolutely. And Just before we get back to your personal story, I'm also curious to ask one more follow up in terms of overcoming adversity. Anyone that watching this and maybe in a place where they've tried to necessarily necessarily get uh, propelled from to get to a better place. So, what would be your message about the importance or how to overcome the struggles of adversity?
Yeah, you know, I think that there's something really important to be said about going for what you want, no matter what people think. You know, there's always possibility. There's always the chance for greatness. Statistically, I should be dead or in jail. I should have never written a book because I graduated high school with like a 1.1 GPA. I should have never done half of the things that I've done in my life because people always looked at me and said, "You're never going to be capable of doing that." The number one thing that we can do is start with instilling belief in ourselves. Now that's hard, right? That's one of the most difficult things that we'll ever do is how do you learn to love yourself? How do you build self-esteem? How do you build self-belief? And then leverage that to step into life on your terms. I think ultimately the number one thing that we can do is solidify our own personal sovereignty that then puts us in a position to be successful because instead of leveraging the world to make us feel good about ourselves, we start with us first, right? It's so that airplane mentality, put your oxygen mask on first. Like if we can build who we are first, that will seep out into the world and it'll be beautiful.
I know you spent some time in corporate America and you found success there, but you also had to overcome uh, personal obstacles and demons in that experience as well. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, you know, I like I mentioned earlier, I leveraged this idea of money being the cornerstone of success, right? I grew up in an impoverished neighborhood in a zip code where you're more statistically probable to go to prison than you are to college. I come from a poor family. No one in my family's gone to college. Most of my family didn't have high school diplomas, and yet I was like, okay, how do I get into corporate America and learn how to make money, right? And sure, some of it's luck, but a lot of it's hard work and me really figuring out the baseline that they didn't teach us. And that was how to interview, how to have a conversation, how to, you know, show up in a suit and tie. Like I remember the interview for that job was my best friend had to teach me how to tie my tie because I had no idea how to do it at 20 years old. And so as I was in that, one of the things that happened is I started to make money and I started to really kind of spiral because I didn't understand that money was this fuel that could either make your life better or make your life worse. And because I hadn't really defined my values or my boundaries or who it was that I was or wanted to be, I found myself in so many precarious situations, and many of them were kind of a mirror of my teens because in my teens I was doing insane things, breaking into people's houses and stealing cars and running with guns and selling drugs and all of those things. And as an adult, it's not that I was doing those things illegally, right? But I was doing them in excess, like too much drugs, too much alcohol, being in Vegas a lot, stuff like that, right? And so when I think about that, what was happening is I was just hiding. Kevin, I was hiding from the idea that I had to face the truth of my past, and that truth being kind of dark, and that truth being about abuse, and that truth being about I needed to do the work. One of the best things, literally the best thing that ever happened in my life was having that breakdown moment where I had that reflection in the mirror because I made a decision that I was going to change everything about my life. And I don't know that that would have happened had I not had that career, which kind of catapulted a lot of the bad things in my life that occurred. But I'm happy that it did because I would not be talking to you right now had it not.
And talk to me about how you're spinning it forward now. I know you work with survivors of abuse and you're a coach and a mentor. So tell me about the work you do now and why you're so passionate about that work and what you're most proud of as well.
Yeah, I think, I'll start with the proud because that comes to mind first. I'm super proud that I wrote a book. Man, for a kid who barely graduated high school and, struggled really, really hard, to write a book that became an international bestseller is a big deal to me. I'm super proud of that. This work came from part of its necessity, and part of it is because I feel like the universe was like, this is the thing that you're supposed to do. And I remember about 5 years ago, I was just kind of sharing various articles or blogs or topics or whatever things brought interest to my life around the topics of trauma and abuse and the human body and brain and all of those things. And people started reaching out to me and they started saying, this is powerful, this is palatable, this is important, I resonate with this, I understand this. And slowly that transformed. And to be honest with you, it was never my intention to like step into this pathway. The only thing I ever wanted to do was help people just understand that maybe life could be different. And what happened is the more that I did that, the more it developed and the more that it started to transform into this thing where it became coaching and mentorship and teaching a workshop internationally and being on podcast and writing the book and, having this incredible group of the Unbroken Nation, the people who follow me on all the social medias. But it's about us, right? The thing that fulfills me the most about this is these moments when people say, I get it, or I understand, or this thing changed my life, or this mindset shift was impactful, because those are the moments that are most important. Because I think about this a lot. You asked me about paying it forward. And to be honest with you, I don't know if this is paying it forward because I don't know what that looks like. I've honestly never defined that. I just looked at it as this is the thing that I'm meant to do. And so I'm going to do it until the day I die. Ultimately, I think about the idea of if I can do this job really effectively, then I can put myself out of business, because that means we would heal generations of people in which we could then stop trauma. And that is the thing that drives me.
And tell me about the book and the podcast that you host, but I'm fascinated to learn about it.
Yeah. The book is called Think Unbroken: Understanding and Overcoming Childhood Trauma. And this was the book that I wrote because I felt like it was the book that I needed to read. What I mean by that is when I was deep into my healing journey about 7-8 years ago, and I was reading all the books, going to all the courses, all the seminars, everything we just touched on, I never quite found something that wrapped it all together, right? And so when I wrote Think Unbroken, it was about how do I take these ideas and concepts and maybe these practicums that I created and put them together along with intrinsic and like intrinsic writing exercises. And so the book is actually meant to be written, and it's part book, part journal, right? And that was because I felt like in these moments in which you are making an understanding of something, the power of writing it down helps solidify it. And the podcast came because I felt like I feel like writing is slow for me. Writing is a very hard practice for me. It takes up a lot of my time. I'm not very fast at it, right? But I'm do a good job at speaking. So I thought to myself, okay, what can I do? I will start this podcast. And so the Michael Unbroken podcast, honestly, it just came from necessity because I wanted to be able to take these concepts and break them down quicker and more effectively in a way that was more palatable for people. And my hope with that is just that, again, same as the book, hopefully somebody will just listen to an episode and go, oh, wow, I understand something about myself.
Absolutely. I think self-discovery and self-expression are two very important things. And doing my research on you, you seem to be an open book, willing to share the more vulnerable sides of yourself. And especially for guys, I think that is harder than normal. So I commend you on that.
Thank you, my friend. Yeah, I made a declaration to myself, Kevin, and I said, if I am going to step into this journey, then I am going to do it with full authenticity, full vulnerability. I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between, because it can't always be sunshine and rainbows, man. It can't always be that, but it also can't always be dark. It can't always be this terrible thing, because life has the good and the bad, and that's just what it is. And as men, you know, I'm in the hopes that we will eventually step over that threshold in which we consider it to be odd or out of the nomenclature of the norm to talk about the mental health issues that we face, right? Why can we not hug each other? Why can we not have vulnerable conversations with each other? And my hope is that that will change and continue to change, and that we leverage that community of men together to help make the world a better place. Like, it's a hypothesis clearly, but I think if men hugged more, the world would be a lot less violent.
Hey, I tend to agree with you with that. And I've got a couple more for you. The first is, I'm curious to know, when you're not working, how do you define what fun is for you, buddy?
What's really interesting about that is, like, I actually love to work. I've been an entrepreneur in some sense since I was a little kid, and I love it. And of course I love things like board games with my partner, and I love basketball games, and I love UFC. I'm a UFC addict, actually. So you will always catch me there watching fights. I love going to the movies. Unfortunately, that's been taken away from us. And before the lockdown, I was training for a triathlon, because I like this idea of the physical endurance challenge. So I'll be getting back to that. And I spend a lot of time reading. I'm fascinated with people's stories. I spend a lot of time in nonfiction, trying to not only learn but understand what makes us as human beings.
And Michael, tell me, when your last chapter of life is written, I'm wondering how you would want your legacy to be defined, or for you to be remembered.
Yeah, I often wonder about that, and it's interesting because when I was a kid, I always felt like no one was ever going to care about me. No one was going to notice me. If I died, no one would care. And now I recognize that that's a very different experience. The only thing I care about, like this is real. The only thing I care about on my deathbed is knowing, first and foremost, that I did everything within my power to have the life that I wanted to have. That to me is paramount. And my hope is, by proxy, by doing that, then the legacy that I leave will be that people recognize that they're capable of doing the same thing. That to me is more important than any headstone. It's more important than anything, is that people will recognize that they too have this incredible and beautiful power.
And Michael, if people want to get connected with you, how can I do that, buddy?
Yeah, so I am at Michael Unbroken on all the social media. It's the Michael Unbroken podcast. The book is called Think Unbroken, and my website is thinkunbroken.com.
Hey, Michael, I really want to thank you for having a comprehensive, consequential, and revealing conversation with me this evening. I really enjoyed our engaging in conversation, and want to thank you for being vulnerable, authentic, and for joining me tonight. It's most appreciated.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. You are one of the best interviews I've ever had. Thank you for your amazing questions. It's amazing to be here with you, Kevin. Stay warm up there, buddy.